Hey guys, Bryan here. So it's been a minute since you've seen me in the channel by myself, but I'm back. So today we're going to talk to Charlie Dennis, the director and writer of a short film called Silent World. He ended up being a very lovely fella. I signed up earlier this month to do Slamdance and cover the Film Festival Express. So expect a lot more of the reviews of the feature films that are going on there. I happened to catch a couple of the short films, and Charlie's film ended up being one of the ones that caught my eye the most. So I invited him to talk to us on the channel, and it turns out he's got some really great ideas about the accessibility of filmmaking and including sort of the entire conversation of filmmaking centered around disabilities and how we should be making great movies that happen to have disabled characters and not movies centered around the disability of the character. And it doesn't seem like a big difference, but there really is. Had a good talk with Charlie. The rest of the interview is going to be him. So thank you all for checking it out, and I will see you when the reviews start popping out. Cheers. And welcome, guys. Today here we have Charlie Dennis, who has directed. Did you write and direct or just direct?
Write and direct, yeah.
Write and directed a short film that is premiering in Slamdance on the 27th called Silent World. It focuses on London and post-apocalypse following a hearing impaired rapper during the apocalypse and sort of emphasizing the terror that is heightened by being impaired in such a world-ending scenario. So Charlie, if I'm correct, this was based kind of on like the experience of Signkid, the actual star of the short, being in the pandemic, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, so Signkid himself is an actual rapper. So he is one of the world's only sort of deaf rappers. He's a hugely interesting guy, and we've made a music video for him before, and that's how we sort of got to know him. But yeah, so effectively Silent World was born from a rap that he wrote after his experience in the pandemic as a member of the deaf community, and just all of the issues basically that he felt during the pandemic and how they were heightened, amplified, and everything was made basically more dangerous in the pandemic that he felt as a member of the deaf community. And the film sort of exaggerates that, reimagines the rap and reimagines the scenario that he felt, and just kind of packages it in hopefully what we want to be an entertaining whilst also enlightening film.
So I will say I watched the thing and I watched a couple of shorts, and Silent World was one of the shorts that struck me the most. I can't say too much about it because the embargo is not lifted until after this releases. But absolutely lovely film, incredibly well-crafted production, and I had a great time watching it. But before we get into any of the specifics of the film, Charlie, give us what's your deal? What's your story?
Well, I write and direct. So I live in London, and I mainly do commercials. Really, is sort of like my main way to make a living as a filmmaker, whilst trying to like push the narrative side of it. It's obviously a tricky world out there. So I pretty much for the past like 5 years I've been trying to make films, narrative things, and just to sort of keep crafting keep honing my craft as director. Like it's mainly been commercials. So I've always had my passion and love in narrative films, so that's what I've been trying to do. So this was a great opportunity for me to sort of like get stuck in there as my first. I've done short films before. This was sort of my first like proper stab at something I was passionate about, a short that I cared about. So that's sort of like how I approach Silent World. But apart from that, it's sort of what I wanted to put out there as my first sort of like debut as a narrative director in the push what I'm trying to do now to move basically into the narrative world and keep moving forward, hopefully to make feature films and TV series. That's the goal for me. And yeah, so I write and direct, and I've pretty much done the whole sort of like film sort of. So I've pretty much done the whole whatever's encompassing film. So I've directed animation and short film, and I've done little bits for feature films now, which is great. Little sort of directed splinter units, and mainly commercials and branded content. And so yeah, so I've sort of tried to work my way up
That's awesome, man.
effectively. Yeah.
Man, for a first jump, I know you've been in the industry for a while, but for a first jump and making like a proper narrative short, you killed it. That
Oh,
was great.
thank you. Thank you.
Um, so let's talk a little bit more about Silent World. So it
Mm,
follows this deaf rapper through the apocalypse. There's a cloud of deadly gas,
mm.
um, and he's trying to survive it while hearing impaired, and that presents a whole lot of challenges on how to get the information to survive and stuff like that. So when we're talking about the experience and how to communicate that on the screen, what was the process like with you as a presumably hearing abled person working with the deaf community to make sure that one, you're portraying things realistically, but also respectfully and not in a way that demeans the deaf community?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of one of the first questions I had myself when like starting up work with Signkid himself. I think some of the early conversations from me to him was kind of like, are we sure I'm the right person to tell the story? Like, so because I had taken his rap and I'd written it into a short film, and sort of like I showed him that, and I'm like, this is what I want to make. This is what I think we should do. And he absolutely loved it. And the more we talked about it, the more we wanted to make it. And but then I was like, did all my research and looked at all these amazing films about the deaf community and made by like deaf filmmakers. And there's this amazing creative community in the deaf world that just isn't really looked at, and it's just sort of overlooked slightly. I'm like, there's a lot of amazing deaf directors here. Why is it right for me, like as a hearing director, to make this? And the conversation sort of went on that Signkid particularly is worried that there's a lot of deaf filmmakers and they make films for the deaf community, but it's really the hearing community that needs to access these films. And it's a hearing community that aren't exposed to these stories. So he kind of wanted a blend. So he thought my sort of experience as a hearing director and his experience as like a deaf creative was like a bit of a perfect match to make this film. So that's a process we started off, and it was firstly like a huge learning curve for me to understand about the deaf community and just all the little things that you just don't sort of like think about, especially when going through a pandemic, like having to wear masks. A lot of deaf people, some of them don't sign language, some of them don't know how to sign language, and they rely entirely on lip reading. The second you wear a mask, all of that gets taken away. Just little things learning like that I wasn't aware of, that I had to sort of be walked through with Signkid, and that influenced a lot of the writing, which is a really sort of like great part of it. And I think that's what helped the script so much, is that what I was learning, I was sort of injecting directly into the script as a member of the hearing community, sort of I'm representing the hearing audience in my writing, and everything that is representing the deaf community is coming directly from Signkid, who is the main actor, and he was sort of like a big creative role in sort of like leading the conversation, I guess, about the deaf community. And he has a big push on trying to make film more accessible, and
Mm-hmm.
he does a lot for the deaf community anyway. So he's a big advocate, and then he's like a huge inspiration for a lot of deaf people out there. Like he's an amazing character. He sets up even like deaf raves and things, so like these huge speakers, and they all like people there completely deaf, and they go and they feel the vibration of the music. It's incredible.
That is
um
incredible. That's awesome.
it's really cool. He's a really cool guy. So a lot of it was sort of like me learning from him, whilst also wanting to make this film for the hearing audience and for the hearing community, trying to represent the deaf community on screen, whilst also sort of generating empathy and trying to ask for empathy from the hearing community, whilst watching this, because it's hard, I guess, in a pandemic, especially COVID. Everybody has their own issues, and everybody's sort of like focusing on themselves. And it's only when you step back and look at it from another person's perspective, you're like, oh, okay, maybe other people had some like more of a difficult time in the pandemic than I have, or I would have thought about it. And it's obviously natural not to think about it, but it just opened my eyes to that element of it, and that it was just fascinating for me. So
Just to be able to see another struggle to that degree.
yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm interested the intersectionality of sort of filmmaking, because I do notice that filmmaking tends to branch off into its own communities. and those
Hmm.
communities start making movies for that community. But they never, oftentimes they don't cross the boundaries of those communities. And I think because I'm a filmmaker myself and I enjoy films and I love the ability for films to connect other people. And I think that was one of the things that struck me about Silent World, was the fact that you have an audience that is hearing, and you are having to find so many little technicalities in how to portray the disability of deafness and hearing impaired to a hearing audience and make it compelling enough for them to care. When you were sat sort of writing the script and you're collaborating with Signkid, who is another person that I'm digging so much more about after hearing him in the short. He's such a phenomenal actor, and he portrayed that role so well. Let's talk technicalities first. What were some of the more technical challenges that you ran into during the production of this, whether it was in the post-production design or whether it was actually to make sure that everybody is on the same page, on the same vision?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there were quite a few interesting hurdles to overcome. Primarily, first off, is communication. Like, you can also probably imagine the film and the process when working with deaf people and deaf creators. It's almost easier to imagine it working with people in a different language.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to have conversations and to sort of like get what I needed across properly, it was often that I would need like a British Sign Language interpreter to help interpret everything we're sort of talking about. And that just takes organization and planning, and you can't just quickly like call someone up and be like, oh, like, brother, I had this amazing idea, like, let's try this for the film. But you can't do that with Signkid when I can't sign to an extent, and Signkid's first language actually isn't English as well. So even just typing in an email, it's stunted communication.
Right.
So that's this obstacle we were trying to face. And even while shooting and on set, like having to wear masks, like, so we bought these see-through masks, which were a bit more helpful. And we hired interpreters on set to be with us at all times. Um, and we got a creative consultant on board, a BSL creative consultant, to basically help stand by me in the monitor and just pick up on all of the little sign language moments that I might not have picked up on, and how I can sort of like adjust the performance in that.
Interesting.
So like how you would sort of react to like speak a line of dialogue, that you would emphasize a word or emphasize something, that can obviously be attributed to sign language. The sign for like thank you or whatever, it doesn't just have to be a simple sign. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, you can make it more powerful, and that
Right.
impacts performance. So that was something I had to just adjust my thinking on. I'm not directing people's dialogue and voice like you would usually do when directing a film, and it's directing their actions and emotions when it's sign language. So that was super interesting. And then another obstacle was in, as you said, in post-production, having Signkid and having the other deaf creatives working on the film to trust me, and in terms of the sound design and the score, and for me to have to sort of explain and tell them exactly what they're listening to. It's something that you don't realize is difficult until you try and explain what is happening like orally in the film, like trying to explain what is happening with the sound. There's a bass rumble here, there's an indicator, because as a hearing audience we rely so heavily on sound cues for things, and like sound kind of influences how you feel in a film. And without that, and trying to explain that is always going to be difficult. And so explaining that was tough in some places, because there are some sound moments that Signkid can't hear, like the music or the bass, or like all the high pass sort of like the sounds that he wouldn't be able to hear. Having to
Right.
explain that and just remember all the little bits to tell him. And sometimes I would forget bits, and he'd be like, oh, well, like, why have I left in this scene, in the edit? Why have I moved from this bed? Why have I left the room? I was like, oh, there's this alarm and there's tannoy going on, and there's something telling you to leave. And he wouldn't know that unless I'd explained it to him before we added all the audio captions and
Right.
descriptions. So that is interesting, and just that whole process, and just how just trying to experience watching a film from the deaf perspective and the hearing perspective, and knowing when to make allowances and when to sort of like when for him to be able to accept that, okay, this scene is more for the hearing audience, again, this scene is more for the sort of deaf audience, and trying to find that balance basically. Because there are some things that a hearing audience would naturally appreciate far more than a deaf audience, especially when it comes to music and sound and dialogue and just the way an actor says a line, things like that. So that was tough. Like the post-production was tough, just that process, just making sure he was happy and his sort of like perspective was being appreciated well on screen and represented well, because we dip in and out of these perspective shifts within the film, like from his perspective and from the hearing audience. And it became hard to sort of explain that, okay, this scene is muffled, like the audience is hearing it from your perspective, because that's the only perspective he's ever experienced.
Right.
So it's hard to explain how that muffling is different to how we're hearing it, and how that's a sort of like a filmmaking tool that we're using to tell the story. But so yeah, just obstacles like that. It just interesting. Like communication was just key. Like just explaining everything and yeah, just trying to balance that line, I guess, and trying to hit all the right sort of like trying to represent it basically correctly with him not being able to hear the film.
Right. Um, sorry, I'm getting my turn. I thought I was reading our email. I find it particularly interesting, and I'm diving a little bit into the technicality of the film because I think it's such a great feat in perspective changes. Because some of my favorite moments of the film are those moments where we're seeing the chaos happening from a hearing perspective, and then we see the same chaos happening from a deaf perspective.
Mm.
And what's amazing to me is that, you know, you as a production, like you guys as a production, have managed to make the chaos feel inherently more stressful in the deaf perspective than it is in the hearing perspective. And I think it works extremely well with the short because you're communicating that hearing people have another form of access that these hearing impaired people don't. And so how did you, when you're on set and you're crafting this film, how are you organizing and what decisions are you making to just be like, I want this to be chaotic no matter whose perspective we're on, but how do we make this even more so when we're watching it from the perspective of Signkid or any of the other hearing impaired characters that may pop up in a film or series like this?
I guess we kind of broke down the script quite heavily before sort of like production, and we had to I had to have sort of a lot of conversations with a sound designer before actually shooting it, which I wouldn't usually do when approaching a project and approaching a film. And I just sort of like knew the moments that I wanted to create those perspective shifts before actually shooting it. So that wasn't a decision that was made in the edit. That was a decision that was made sort of like writing the script. Those perspective shifts always had to be in there. So in those moments of chaos, I knew which parts were in the edit already that we were going to see from Signkid's perspective. So that helped in a way. And it just sort of like was born just from his own like creating those situations in sort of reality and just how he reacted to that became sort of this situation. That's how we created that like chaotic situation. Like we put him in a room and we needed him to sort of like communicate to these hearing people who couldn't sign, who couldn't speak to him in his language, who did have masks on, who did have these big gas masks on, so he couldn't even read the lips, and we're just like pointing and sort of like shouting at him, and the reaction he would get automatically, like the genuine reaction he would get from having somebody point and shout and people rush past him and push past him when he has no idea what's going on and no clue who's saying what. That just became a way that I could get a genuine reaction out of him. So I guess in terms of on set, that was that process. And and it was interesting actually in the post-production after we'd seen those scenes, and because the sound designer so for deaf people you have like a hearing chart, and you can see like you would in sort of like a normal sound
Hmm.
post-production, you can see the different levels and frequencies and the pitch and everything. So you can obviously, when you remove your high pass filters and your low pass filters, you got these charts. It's
Yeah.
hearing and sorry, deaf people do have that from like the hospital, from the doctors. It's like, okay, this is your level of hearing, and it's often a lot more squished than the hearing community.
Oh, that's
And so we were,
fascinating.
yeah, we were able to basically replicate his chart, and basically all of the sort of like higher frequencies that Signkid can't hear, we were able to replicate that in the sound design. So what the audience hears from his perspective is what he is hearing. So that muffled, and so he can hear these very low frequencies and these low bassy tones. So I knew he'd be able to hear these low bassy tones on set, and I knew we'd be able to implement some elements of that. So he gets alarmed for like vibrations and these bassy tones, but all those higher frequency sounds like people shouting, screaming, or like a tannoy or like an announcement, he just won't be able to hear. So knowing that beforehand and being able to find the moments on set that like it would like aid the story in terms of the sounds he couldn't hear, we were able to do. So the extras and the supporting actors and the other actors and the other cast in the films, they would react to, and having him not react to it just realistically, I guess, was quite a useful tool for us when actually trying to make these scenes as realistic as possible.
That's extremely fascinating.
Mm.
I never would have. And first of all, I never would have known that they have their own like little hearing chart
Yeah.
where they can like sort of understand. I think that's when you talk about that. What I'm hearing is that a lot of the hearing community really has no idea about what deaf community goes through, and it's just a fascinating process because film for me, you know, as a hearing audience, has always been so sonically and visually dependent on each other, and like splitting one of those elements straight out of the production or impairing it out of the production is such an intense challenge. And I just think it's absolutely fascinating that you guys managed to do that.
I mean, that's that you sort of like said it perfectly there. They're like hearing and sorry, sound and visuals in a film are so closely related for a lot of people, like, and you just expect them both to work so sympathetically with each other. When you do take one out, or when you do switch that perspective, or when you force an audience into an unusual perspective, something like you take something away from them, you get it's a completely different shift. It's a completely different shift in how they're viewing things. And that was just a really interesting tool in knowing that, and from a hearing perspective, and knowing that what happens if I put my hands over my ears and just watch something, or even talk, and just even how I hear my own voice when I stick my hands over my ears. It's a completely different perspective, and that became sort of like a bit of a theme. Like, how do we put the audience in Signkid's shoes in these moments? Like, how do we create those moments of panic, and just little things that we wanted to do, even like the subtitles, like on some moments in the subtitles, we chose to sort of like blur them when Signkid was wearing a mask and it was a bit foggy.
I thought that was such a cool little touch. Yeah.
It sort of like it's everything he sees, he needs to see to be able to understand. So
Right.
if he can't see and if he can't read the sign language, he doesn't hear. So I didn't want to let the audience hear and read things that he wasn't also able to hear. So every time we're in his perspective, I wanted just to sort of like remove those sort of like helping hands out to the audience, because we would rely on a subtitle for sign language,
Right.
but if Sign Kid can't read it, I didn't want the audience to be able to read it. It's frustrating, it's annoying, but I like the idea of playing with that. And we were sort of like balancing how far to push it, how much to annoy the audience, but we still wanted to create like an entertaining film that the hearing audience would enjoy. So it was finding that balance, and how far to sort of push it, and how much to take away from the audience, I guess.
Nice. I'm really curious. how did the story come about? So I know that you're working with Signkid, but how did that relationship start? How did you guys start working together?
So he's a rapper. So he's, as I mentioned, so he is one of the only deaf rappers in the world, and he wears this sort of vibration plate, and he feels the beat, and he raps through the use of sign language, and it's incredible. So Loki Films is the production company that I'm sort of repped for commercials and now narrative, and they'd made a music video for him before. So it was like a BSL music video for him, and so that relationship already existed between them.
Okay.
And then he sort of like came back to them and approached them. And the BBC here in England, they were producing a series of like pieces of work and art and things like that for the neurodiverse, the disabled, sort of like any deaf or like visually impaired people. So there was about 10 films funded to the BBC, or 10 pieces of art funded through the BBC that got this small grant basically to go away and create a piece of art that sort of reflected life in quarantine. So the thing was called Culture in Quarantine. So different types of art in quarantine. And Signkid was one of those. So he got this grant, and then he approached Loki Films again and said, "Look, I've got this rap. I've written this rap for it's called Silent World, and it's basically my expression on what I experienced during COVID." And it's a really cool rap, really intense. And he wanted a music video originally, and we just thought it was such a bigger and better story than a music video would be able to do justice, I guess.
Right.
So I took it and I wrote it into a short film, and yeah, and that, after speaking to him about that and just sort of been like, do you want to make a film instead? Should we turn this into a short film? And yeah, and then he got on board with the idea. So that's where that initial relationship was built.
That's awesome. I want to ask this just because the aesthetic of the short is so specifically grimy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the correct word to put it, but it's so UK grime, kind of like Children of Men. It's got that vibe to it. Um, is that on purpose? Did that just come about an accident? Did that facilitate? When you're telling the story and you're trying to think of this post-apocalyptic scenario that feels kind of fresh in comparison to a lot of the scenarios that we're seeing in cinema lately, are you what inspirations did you get to sort of get this grimy, dirty feeling of this particular apocalypse?
Well, a lot of the places that Signkid mentioned in his rap, places like Brixton, place like Hackney, place like Peckham, they're places in London. They're places that perhaps aren't the most aesthetically beautiful places already. So they're a little bit sort of like overtrod in a way.
Mm-hmm.
They've got their own sort of like personality already, and they've already got their own like feeling and vibe in it. And it's a little bit sort of like brutalist. England and London is typically grey anyway. And so like taking like an apocalyptic version out of London, I wanted it to stay connected enough to modern day and not make it feel too sort of like intense and sci-fi and futuristic. So I guess it was just already taking not to sort of like shoot London down too much, but taking from what London already offers in those areas and just like hyper extending it and just really sort of like taking from these sort of kind of like grimy places already and just reimagining them and just making them bigger than life already.
Yeah.
And so we could basically fall back on a lot of like locations that already existed. We could just find like those sort of like grimy places around those sort of like streets of places like that you might not want to find yourself out at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday evening.
That's
So,
awesome.
yeah, so it was just born from London. I wanted to stay London. I wanted to have that sort of like vibe. If you're from England or from London, you'd be able to watch it and be like, all right, these like feel like the ends. Like these feel like that feels like Peckham. This feels like
Right.
yeah, like the sort of like the streets.
Yeah, as an
To
American audience member, I really did felt like you captured the UK grime rap aesthetic and sort of like just put it on screen. Extremely well done. As you
thank
can
you.
tell, I'm a big fan of the short. I
Yeah,
liked it a lot.
no, thank you.
Um, excuse me. So another one of the things that I'm curious as is like, how involved was Signkid during the creative process when you're drafting up the script and making all these other creative decisions?
Pretty involved, but to an extent. So he's an incredibly creative guy as itself. So he has some amazing ideas. But when it comes to film, he sort of like let us take as much control as we needed, to a point that it didn't impact the story that he initially wanted to tell. So the story, I guess, is a story that I wrote, but it's born from his experience of the pandemic. Um, and we decided early on that in this case, in this film, we did want it to be Signkid's own personal experience. We didn't necessarily wanted it to be like the experience of the whole deaf community, because every single deaf person has a completely different experience and completely different way of hearing and experiencing the world. Some people sign, some people don't. Some people lip read, some people don't. Some people have different levels of hearing. Some people empathize with the deaf community. Some people see it as a disability. Some people don't. So there's a lot going on there, and it's a very complex community that we couldn't and we didn't want to represent all in one go. Especially when there's a lot of deaf people that don't associate with being deaf, and they don't see it as a disability, and it's just part of them. So there's a lot of like fine lines to tread. So we wanted to tell it from Signkid's perspective. So there are some things that I initially added into the script, like backstory, like history, like things of him growing up and his childhood, and questions I'd asked him and spoke to him beforehand, and just things that I wanted to sort of like capture. And even like I wanted to approach the romantic side of it, like maybe like create like a little romance between like a hearing person and a deaf person, and things like that, and his family and his mother and his growing up, and some things he got rid of immediately and was like, I don't want to talk about this in this film. And some things were like, I've never experienced this, so I don't want it to be in this film. It's like, okay. And some things we sort of like agreed on that would just help the film aesthetically, or help the film sort of like in the story telling perspective that he might not have experienced, but he sort of like thought, okay, yeah, this could be good. So all of the drafts would basically go through him, and he'd look at it and be like, yeah, this is great. Some things that didn't make too much sense to him that would make sense to a hearing community, he'd then be like, great, I trust you, whatever. So he did have a big helping hand in it, and it was sort of something that I wanted to make sure that he was 100% happy with, and I was representing his own story as well as I could. So yeah, it was a really good process, really good collaborative process there. And we're sort of like hoping to continue that. We sort of like currently we're going to take the idea, we're going to take the basically like the slate of Silent World, and we're sort of like projecting it as like a bit of like a short TV series. I'm going to hopefully take that around the film market soon, and just try and like see if there's any interest in it, for like a longer form TV thing that's not necessarily about Signkid, but it's about this sort of like world, and someone sort of from like a so the deaf community trying to navigate their way through like a bit of a crisis, like a post-apocalyptic or very dangerous crisis. So that's sort of like the next steps, and we're hoping to, well, we are working with Signkid again in that way, but focusing on a much larger scale there. So
Just expanding the scope of the universe, so to speak.
exactly, yeah. So that relationship is staying strong and working through it at the moment. So it's really good.
That's amazing. Is there anything that you didn't necessarily get to explore in the short that you would like to tackle a little bit more aggressively in the long form if it picks up?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really interested in, well, I mean, there's a lot of things that I just learned just speaking to Signkid that are just so amazing, and something that you just wouldn't experience, like sex, for instance, between two deaf people. If the lights are off, they can't communicate.
That's true.
you need you
Never would have
need
thought about that.
visually be able to see to communicate. So just think like little moments like that, and like eating dinner at a table. The deaf community need to eat really fast and then talk, or it takes fucking forever because you're eating and then you have to communicate, and then you're eating and then you have to communicate. So just moments like, it's the little tiny like moments about being deaf that are so personal to being deaf. It just fascinates me, things that I would massively overlook, like how you communicate, like whilst like, you've got your knife and your fork in your hand when you can't sort of like speak, because some people don't have a voice, some people do, and just so a lot of things like that. And I really want to explore backstory and sort of like how being deaf growing up in a society that was like not necessarily well equipped to sort of like encompassing everyone, and like they are still a very marginalized community, and just sort of like I'd like to explore the sort of like coming of age element of
Right.
being deaf, or living with a disability in a world that's kind of not designed for disabled people or people with like a hearing impairment. So I'd like to explore that, and I'd like to explore it with different disabilities as well, and just find those sort of like little moments, and just like force it into the hearing audiences and the seeing audiences, like faces, and show us that like, okay, there's a lot more going on out there, and we need to sort of like make film especially more accessible, really.
Right.
That was the main goal. And then so I'd like to explore that a bit more, I think. But yeah, just makes it like, it's the little things to me that were far more interesting than the big issues that a lot of us know about. And that helps us connect to it a lot more, in my opinion. So I would have liked to focus on those things, but I think I need a bit of time to build those up. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are also the kinds of things that ground the person, the character in reality as
yeah,
well. I feel like a lot of the big moments are big moments, but it's not, it's only the tiny ones that like really clue you in into the everyday lives of these people.
exactly.
Um I have one more question. I'm really curious as to how do you, and this is presents a challenge, and this may be some more from like the business side, but how do you as a, hearing director, and you're making this product that's about the deaf community, when you're talking to people that are potentially going to want to like invest in your film, or you're trying to get financiers for your product, um, there is there's a very, what I think, obvious challenge there of making them empathize with the story that you're telling. Has that been a challenge for you at all? Have you felt like there's been a relatively good amount of empathy towards like stories like these, or is that, how's that been? How navigating that business side of it for this kind of product? How's that been for you?
I think just learning from Signkid's perspective as a deaf creative, and he gets frustrated from sort of deaf filmmakers making films for the deaf community. The deaf community is a very small community. There's a lot of people, but still it's quite small, and they're not the issue. The hearing community are the issue. So in some respects, I've got a bit of an advantage as a hearing director, and being able to speak to sort of like these execs and sort of like the money making people and the sort of the financiers, and be able to like explain, and from their perspective being able to relate to them as like a hearing person of the hearing community, and being able to sort of like talk with sort of like a shared experience, and apply that to making a film about the deaf community, or making the film about somebody with a deaf community. And I think that's something that I've always been interested as well, just taking these stories and placing them in a scenario, and placing them in films and stories that everybody is going to be able to enjoy. I don't want to make a film, if this extends, don't want to make the film just for the hearing community, and also don't want to make it just for the deaf community. I want to find that great balance. I want to package it in something exciting and entertaining. I'm not here to make the kitchen sink dramas that other directors can make and can write in. That's not my goal. I want to entertain. Like a lot of it's an escapism for a lot of people. Like I find it boring to tell another sad story about somebody who's hard done by. Like it's that's too easy, and it's too sort of like, you're not gonna get the attention of people. People, like, you look at the films people are watching, and you look at the films that are making money. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna go to an investor and be like, I've got this incredibly sad story about somebody like with a disability, and everybody has to watch it. Like, it's great, it's beautiful, whatever, but that's not the films people are gonna watch. My granddad isn't going to sit down and watch a film that he knows nothing about. But if I packaged it in like, oh, like, granddad, there's this really cool sort of like Italian mafia mob film that you'll love. It just happens that the main character is completely deaf and he operates with sign language, and that's the film I think a lot of people want to watch. So that's the sort of headspace and approach that I go into it. And it's been pretty well received when I go into it like that, and they kind of see it a bit more from my perspective. And when I'm not sort of like pitching a film that's about being deaf, and pitching a film that's about like how hard done by the deaf community is, and when I'm pitching it about like an awesome fucking film, an awesome character that people are going to want to watch and people are get excited about, and there's a deaf character there and he's the main focus, and I find ways to subtly sew in the real story and the real sort of reason why I want to make this, and the real sort of like issues. And then when people finish watching me, like, oh fuck yeah, okay, like, I've never thought of it that way, I've never seen like how a deaf person would have seen it. That's the way I want to approach it, and so that's hopefully the way I can sort of like get these films off the ground. And because you see it all the time, like the real issues and the real stories and the real films that people are making, people aren't watching, and it's
Yeah.
super sad. And if I could find a different way to manage that, and a different way to make these important films, then that's what I'll do.
Also, you make a interesting point when your film is just a good film that happens to have a character that is deaf or disabled in any other way. You're There's something socially interesting about intersectionality in film and filmmaking in general, where you are bringing into light all these issues and you're telling a story and you're kind of putting your thesis statement out there, but you're doing it in such a consumable way and such a digestive or such an easily digested way that an audience doesn't really have a choice but to say, oh, I really never really did think about that. So socially, I think you're doing a fantastic thing for film in general. I think that films like this should be much more accepted, and I think the focus on filmmaking and the focus on diversity in filmmaking in general should be just make a great story and then put that character in it, you know. And I really love that approach, and I admire that approach from filmmaking, because from my experience watching the short, not only was I thoroughly entertained, I walked out of it going like, yeah, being deaf during COVID must have fucking sucked. It's like,
Yeah.
that's a hard challenge. And
Yeah.
I never would have thought of that if that approach hadn't existed. I think that's a really great approach to filmmaking, and I absolutely love that. It's great.
No, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's not necessarily sugarcoating it, and it's not necessarily sort of like hiding anything. It's still making great films. It's still making films people want to watch. But obviously, it's all done for a reason. But if we can
Yeah.
sort of like cleverly manage it and cleverly sort of like give people that little pill, but it's like packaged in a bar of chocolate, then like we both win. Like,
You're in. That's amazing, man. Listen, let's start wrapping up because I know that you got to do some more press runs. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, or anything that hasn't come up that you find yourself really wanting to talk about?
Not particularly. I think we sort of like covered most of the basis, and we sort of like spoke about the film, and but yeah, it's nothing really that I can on the top of my head.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Listen, well, thank you so much for joining me on the interview. I'll link you to it once everything is done. I know that the film premieres in Slamdance. It premieres on the
Yep.
27th. That's when everything becomes live. I am going to be writing and shooting a review of it. That'll also become available on the 27th as well. Once the film kind of makes its way out of the festival circuit, how can we support it and how can we watch it and sort of help get traction of the concept in general?
Well, it will live on Slamdance. Have like a channel built, so you will still be able to go and watch it. So people can buy sort of like the Slamdance passes and can still watch the film Slamdance. It will be on the BBC for people watching in the UK, so it'll be on BBC iPlayer, which will be cool. And apart from that, it's Slamdance is its first festival, so it's the first festival we submitted to and the first festival that accepted it, which is super exciting. So it's very early on in its festival run.
Oh,
So
nice.
we're still hoping to sort of like nail down some of those, like the European premieres and the Asian and like the African premieres and stuff. So it'll still be popping around film festivals, I think, and hope for a while. But apart from that, we'll be we'll be able to find it like on social channels and with on all the filmmakers and Signkids as well, and there'll be ways to watch it even if you just sort of like type it in and Google it and things like that.
You'll find it.
Yeah, but there's no real sort of, there's no website and there's no way yet to sort of like follow it really. It would just be Vimeo links and Slamdance channels. So
Okay,
that'd be the way really.
cool. Is there any social media you'd like to plug in and throw at us?
I mean, there's my own. I'm not usually too good at plugging that sort of stuff, but I mean, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, we don't have to.
Just search me and find me. They can, like Loki Films with the production company, the Signkid as well. Like, go and support Signkid. Like, he will always be sharing stuff about the deaf community and amazing art stuff going on, and you'll be able to find his work. So you'll be able to find him on Signkid, and he's created an awesome platform called viewable.tv, which creates sign slang for British people. So it's slang that isn't accepted, it isn't readily available in like dictionaries. So like slang words that you would use, he's created sign language for them. So that's really cool. So you can go check that out. Yeah, it's amazing. Just even at London, like words that you'd use in London, like slang, like fam, blood, like ting, shit like that, like just local words. He's created slang and sign slang for it. It's just, so he's got a lot of fucking cool stuff going on, and you can check out more about the silent raves that he does, and yeah, there's hopefully be more collaborations between us happening. So it's a good place to follow it.
Amazing, man. Well, listen, thank you so much. Silent World, absolutely lovely short film. I hope that you guys get it extended, and if you do and if it runs, I'll be one of the first people watching it. Truly fantastic.
Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing us a space to talk about it, and for being so professional and just sort of like well built up with it. So yeah, I really appreciate that, because it gives us a space to talk about it. So yeah, it means a lot.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, and if I'll put any links, any relevant links, I'll put them at the bottom of the description. And for those of you that are watching, thank you so much for joining us. Charlie here has done a phenomenal job with the film, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. So thank all of you.
Thank you very much.